You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
How many discounts does USAA Auto Insurance offer? Too many to say here. Multi-vehicle discount, safe driver discount, new vehicle discount, storage discount, legacy.
How many discounts will you stack up? Visit USAA.com/auto discounts. Restrictions apply.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to episode number 493 of our Civil War podcast. My name is Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello y'all, welcome to the podcast. As y'all will recall, by the end of the last episode, it was May 24th, 1864, and although the Federals thought the Confederates were falling back from the North Anna River and withdrawing off to the south, in reality, the rebels hadn't retreated, but instead had taken up a new defensive position centered upon Ox Ford on the North Anna.
The new Confederate defensive position resembled an inverted V, with the vertex at Ox Ford and the shanks running southwest and southeast to cover Hanover Junction. The entire line was heavily entrenched since the rebel troops had thrown up earthworks all night and improved them during the day. As Confederate Brigadier General Evander Law explained it, the result was that Robert E. Lee had placed Grant, quote, in what may be called a military dilemma. He had cut his army in two by running it upon the point of a wedge, end quote, with the point of the wedge being at Ox Ford.
Law continued, observing that Grant, quote, could not break the point which rested upon the river, and the attempt to force it out of place by striking on its sides must of necessity be made without much concert of action between the two wings of his army, neither of which could reinforce the other, while his opponent could readily transfer his troops, as needed, from one wing to the other, across the narrow space between them.
In other words, by creating the inverted V position, Robert E. Lee brilliantly retrieved a situation that had seemed badly compromised by the Federal bridgeheads across the North Anna at Jericho Mill and Chesterfield Bridge. By constructing, overnight, a new defensive position that allowed him to remain below the North Anna but above the South Anna, Lee could continue to cover Hanover Junction, while at the same time, the nature of the wedge, with the point at Ox Ford, placed Grant on the horns of a dilemma, since it left the Yankees with no easy way to crack open the Confederate position.
One of Robert E. Lee's aides, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Venable, later claimed that Lee had larger aspirations than merely a successful defense. In a speech he gave in Richmond in 1873, Venable said that Lee had intended to exploit Ulysses S. Grant's dilemma by launching the decisive counterattack that he'd been itching to deliver since the start of the campaign.
Venable maintained that Lee intended to have A.P. Hill attack Warren's Fifth Corps, which had crossed the North Anna upstream at Jericho Mill and was separated from the rest of the Army of the Potomac. Venable said Lee was hopeful such an attack would succeed in smashing Fifth Corps, quote, but the main plan miscarried through some mishap.
Venable said the main reason the Confederates failed to launch a major attack on May 24th was the poor health of Robert E. Lee, who was suffering from a debilitating gastrointestinal illness.
Venable recalled, quote, as he lay prostrated by his sickness, he would often repeat, "We must strike them a blow. We must strike them a blow." But though he still had reports of the operations in the field constantly brought to him and gave orders to his officers, Lee, confined to his tent, was not Lee on the battlefield." End quote.
Despite Venable's claims, the question remains, did Robert E. Lee intend to launch a major counterattack on May 24th? Generations of Southern historians have maintained that he did. Nonetheless, aside from Venable's account, evidence that Lee planned to attack is scanty.
Other rebel officers in a position to know about the contemplated attack failed to mention it, and no surviving contemporaneous correspondence alludes to such an operation, and the Confederate troop movements made on the night of May 23rd, 24th were limited and defensive in nature.
A.P. Hill didn't make the slightest preparation to launch an attack on May 24th, and his troops were arrayed in a single line of battle, with only 2 brigades in reserve.
Anderson's corps remained on the defensive as well, and although Ewell's corps did launch a counterattack on the afternoon of the 24th against John Gibbon's division of Federals, that attack was limited in scope and obviously calculated to avoid a major battle.
In addition, although impressive from a defensive standpoint, the Confederates' inverted V was not self-evidently a good position from which to launch an offensive. It lacked depth, and in the event of a reversal, it would have been difficult to sustain such a line and even harder to retreat from it, particularly with the South Anna River flowing immediately to the south.
In any case, if Ulysses S. Grant perceived the Army of the Potomac to be in mortal danger from Lee's inverted V position, he failed to show it. The next day, May 25th, Union scouts aggressively probed the new Confederate lines and by noon had an accurate picture of their layout. That day, Grant informed Henry Halleck in Washington, quote, "The enemy are evidently making a determined stand between the 2 Annas."
However, far from anticipating a Confederate counterattack, Grant assumed that Lee would remain on the defensive. He told Halleck, quote, "It will probably take us 2 days to get in position for a general attack or to turn their position."
With the 2 armies firmly in contact once more, Grant was able to make major revisions in his entire plan of campaign in Virginia. First, it was definitely time to pull the plug on Butler's Bermuda Hundred operation. Grant issued orders for the bulk of Butler's Army of the James, now commanded by Baldy Smith, to land on the north bank of the Pamunkey River, opposite White House Landing, and then march up to join the Army of the Potomac. Troops should be left to hold the James River as far as City Point, but just enough to do the job, and on the assumption that the enemy, quote, "will not undertake any offensive operations there, but will concentrate everything here."
Grant also had plans for the Federal forces out in the Shenandoah Valley. Franz Sigel was gone, having been relieved on May 21st by Major General David Hunter, who had impressed Grant when the two had met during the Chattanooga campaign.
Hunter was already completing preparations for a renewed advance, and Grant encouraged this, but thought more in terms of a grand raid rather than the occupation of any fixed point. Grant was more interested in having Hunter destroy the infrastructure in the valley, which provided Robert E. Lee's army with foodstuffs and other supplies. Grant wrote, quote, "If Hunter can possibly get to Charlottesville and Lynchburg, he should do so, living on the country. The railroads and canals should be destroyed beyond possibility of repair for weeks. Completing this, he could find his way back to his original base, or to Gordonsville to join this army."
As yet unclear to Ulysses S. Grant was the next move against Robert E. Lee. No one seriously suggested a direct attack on the Confederates' inverted V position protecting Hanover Junction, so the question was whether to turn it by going west or east.
An eastward turning movement would be simple, and a mere repetition of the maneuver that had carried the Army of the Potomac first to Spotsylvania and then to the North Anna. But for that very reason, Lee would be expecting it, so the chance to capitalize on any mistakes Lee might make would be minimal.
Moving to the west around the rebel army's left flank would be unexpected and so would have the advantage of surprising Lee. It would also place the Federals squarely athwart the Virginia Central Railroad, thereby depriving Lee of his best link to the Shenandoah Valley.
A move to the west would also offer the chance for a direct move on Richmond from the north, which would force Lee to fight to the finish, defending the Confederate capital. Both the east and west flanking options were debated at a council of war held on the evening of May 25th, and Grant initially decided to head west, a move reportedly endorsed by Gouverneur K. Warren and Artillery Chief Henry Hunt.
But Grant quickly changed his mind. Upon reflection, he decided a movement to the west presented too many difficulties, especially with regard to a viable line of supply. All in all, shifting once again to the southeast was the better option.
Grant therefore told George Meade to prepare the Army of the Potomac for a general movement in the direction of Hanovertown, a small settlement on the Pamunkey River about 15 miles as the crow flies east of Hanover Junction. Grant's instructions to Meade were specific, stipulating not just where the different parts of the army should go, but exactly how they should proceed, right down to the order of march.
Sheridan's Federal cavalry had arrived the day before, after giving Richmond a scare and getting into the fight at Yellow Tavern that led to Jeb Stuart's death. Now that Sheridan's horsemen were back with the army, they could screen the upcoming movement.
To deceive Lee about his intentions, Grant told Sheridan to have James Wilson's division carry out an elaborate feint against the Confederate left to the west on May 26th. Wilson's troopers duly went forward, dismounted to look like infantry, and with the support of a dozen cannon, got into a noisy fight with the rebels. And the ruse worked, since Robert E. Lee briefly believed the Yankees were going to move around his left flank.
Before leaving the North Anna, Grant made certain that work parties thoroughly wrecked the local railroads. Although it was still unusual for the Army of the Potomac to devote much effort to the destruction of Confederate infrastructure, the Western Federal armies had been doing it routinely for a full year.
The work began on May 25th and continued the next day as large work parties, often entire brigades, were given the task of wrecking the rail lines. Hundreds of men would line up on one side of the railroad, then, at a signal, would heave up the track, flip it over, and systematically dismantle it. Cross ties were piled up and set on fire. Once a sizable blaze got good and hot, soldiers placed the iron rails into the flames until the metal sagged from the heat. In order to make it that much harder for Confederate work crews to salvage them, the rails were often twisted, frequently around a nearby tree. At least 8 miles of the Virginia Central Railroad, Lee's link to the Shenandoah Valley, received this treatment, as did the tracks of the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad as far north as Milford Station. It was hot, hard work, but the destruction had a carnival aspect to it, as many of the men made a game of it and thoroughly enjoyed themselves.
Although the thorough destruction of the local rail lines was almost the only positive achievement that Grant could show for the Army's 3-day stay along the North Anna, nevertheless, his assumptions about the condition of the enemy army raised his hopes regarding scoring a decisive success in the near future.
Lee's army is really whipped, Grant assured Halleck on May 26th. Reports that Confederate prisoners were saying the rebel army was demoralized, and above all, Lee's evident determination to fight only from the cover of earthworks, led Grant to conclude, quote, "A battle with them outside of entrenchments cannot be had. Our men feel that they have gained the morale advantage over the enemy. I may be mistaken, but I feel that our success over Lee's army is already assured."
Whatever the occasion, effortless elegance is right this way. Because Hilton brings you new ways to stay courtesy of the Nomad London. And it doesn't stop at award-winning dining in a space draped in velvet and illuminated by vintage chandeliers. No, this day goes beyond with unparalleled personalized service and attentive hospitality. Oh, and did we mention the Nomad London can be booked using your Hilton Honors points at Hilton.com? Hilton, for the stay.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. When your computer breaks, you don't wait for it to magically start working again. You fix the problem. So why wait to hire the people your company desperately needs? Use Indeed's sponsored jobs to hire top talent fast. And even better, you only pay for results. There's no need to wait. Speed up your hiring with a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
By the time Grant sent that optimistic message to Halleck, the preliminaries for the new turning movement had already begun. The Teamsters took their supply and ammunition wagons over to the north bank of the North Anna on the evening of May 25th, and then the Federal artillery batteries limbered up and followed.
The movement began in earnest the next day, spearheaded by two of Sheridan's cavalry divisions, those of T.A. Torbert and David McMurtry Gregg, and a 6th Corps division under David Russell. The Union horsemen rode until they neared the Pamunkey crossings around midnight. Next morning, the cavalry drove away a handful of rebel horsemen and took control of Hanovertown. Engineers threw up 2 pontoon bridges, and by 9 a.m. on May 27th, Sheridan's cavalry was firmly on the south bank. Russell's division of infantry crossed 2 hours later.
By then, the rest of the Army of the Potomac was also well underway, having begun its movement not long after midnight. 5th and 6th Corps marched by one route, while 2nd and 9th Corps took a parallel route farther north. Despite inevitable delays, as some units waited for others to clear the road, the Army made good time.
The next day, May 28th, the Army completed its crossing to the south bank. Most of the Federal infantry was across by noon. The last of the Yankees reached the far shore shortly after midnight on May 29th.
It was impossible to keep so large a maneuver under wraps for very long, and by May 27th, Lee knew that Grant had withdrawn from in front of the Confederates' inverted V defensive position, and that a mixed force of Federal cavalry and infantry had been spotted down by Hanovertown.
These signs indicated that the Yankees were making another movement to the southeast, around the Confederates' right flank. That being so, Robert E. Lee issued orders for his army to fall back 12 miles to Atlee Station, which left him barely 9 miles from Richmond. Both armies were now returning to the scene of the battles they fought during McClellan's Peninsula Campaign back in the spring and summer of 1862. Veterans recognized familiar place names, but aside from memories, the flat, featureless landscape had little to recommend it.
Except for Richmond, at the zone's far southwestern edge, the region had no settlements of consequence. Most of it was just worn-out farmland where the soil was sandy and bleached of nutrients from decades of relentless tobacco cultivation. Most roads were little more than dirt tracks connecting the area's farms.
Stands of pine and oak trees grew in irregular patches, while here and there the landscape was cut by black, evil-looking little creeks that fed into the region's principal streams, the Pamunkey River to the north and Chickahominy River to the south. Both rivers and nearly all the creeks were as much swamp as streams, which made them significant military obstacles. The largest stream was Totopotomoy Creek, which flowed sluggishly from its source just north of Richmond on an east-west line until it emptied into the Pamunkey River 2 miles below Hanovertown. The best place to stop the Yankees, Lee knew, was a low ridge that commanded the creek's south bank.
Trouble was, the Confederates had lost contact with much of the enemy army, and until Lee had hard information that most of the Yankees had crossed the Pamunkey, he couldn't commit himself fully to defending the Totopotomoy.
There was always the chance that Grant might do something else after all. For instance, backtrack suddenly to Hanover Junction and come straight down the Telegraph Road toward Richmond. So, until Lee knew for sure, he had to guard against several possibilities. To get a solid fix on the position of the Federal Army, on the morning of May 28th, Lee ordered Wade Hampton to make a reconnaissance in force toward the Hanovertown crossings, penetrate the enemy's cavalry screen, and find the Union infantry. Hampton departed at once with 4 cavalry brigades, a battery of horse artillery, and 3 regiments of mounted infantry. The mounted infantry were just up from South Carolina and commanded by Brigadier General Matthew Butler, though led on the 28th by Colonel Benjamin Rutledge.
3/4 of a mile short of a spot called Hawes Shop, where several roads intersected, the Confederates ran into a brigade of Federal cavalry. As it happened, the Yankees were the vanguard of a Union reconnaissance in force designed to get a clear read on the whereabouts of the Confederate Army. The battle that ensued was one of the longest and fiercest cavalry fights of the entire war.
The Federal Cavalry Brigade, belonging to the division of David McMurtry Gregg, was commanded by Brigadier General Henry Davies. It had no sooner reached the Hawes Shop intersection than Wade Hampton's rebels came barreling up. The Confederates briefly drove in Davies' pickets before they fell back a short distance to the west.
Davies pursued the Confederates, found that they had dismounted, taken up a position astride the main road, and were scrambling to construct a barricade. A stream to the north and a mill pond to the south made the rebel position impossible to turn. That meant if the Federals were going to get past, they would have to go straight over the Confederates.
But the rebels showed no inclination to budge from the spot. They kept up such a steady, heavy fire from behind the barricade that the Yankees soon concluded that they faced enemy infantry as well as cavalry. They weren't entirely wrong, since part of Hampton's force consisted of Butler's dismounted, mounted infantry. In any case, Gregg brought up a second brigade, but found he still lacked the muscle to dislodge the stubborn Confederates. So he sent a message to Sheridan asking for reinforcements.
In the meantime, the Federal horse soldiers fired at the rebels as fast as they could. Since they were armed with repeating rifles, the volume of fire was tremendous. A Pennsylvania trooper estimated that the 200 men in his unit fired 18,000 rounds during the fighting at Hawes Shop. Their weapons got so hot that from time to time they had to stop firing to let the barrels cool.
The fighting continued like that, intense but inconclusive, for over 5 hours. A frustrated Gregg told one of Sheridan's staff officers that with reinforcements he could, quote, destroy the equilibrium and go forward, end quote. But the staff officer informed Gregg that, unfortunately, the rest of the Union cavalry was mostly committed to the task of screening the Army's movements.
Plenty of Federal infantry was nearby, and Sheridan asked Meade to give him 2 brigades, but Meade refused. Exasperated, Sheridan cast about for other troops and found that George Armstrong Custer's brigade of Michigan cavalrymen was at loose ends at the moment, so he immediately ordered Custer to reinforce Gregg.
Custer's brigade of horsemen entered the battle just as, across the lines, Wade Hampton sent word for his brigades to disengage. You see, from prisoners, he had discovered the whereabouts of the Federals' 5th and 6th Corps, and with that information in hand, he decided he'd fulfilled his mission and that it was time to break off the fight at Hawes Shop. As the Confederate troopers withdrew, it looked like they would get away scot-free, but then some of Butler's inexperienced mounted infantry mistook a shift in positions by the Federals for a retreat, and they charged forward recklessly, only to be hammered by Custer's just arriving brigade of Union horsemen. At least 80 of the Confederates were taken prisoner, and Custer's men charged on into the main body of the rebels. Wade Hampton eventually fought his way out to safety, but took significant losses in doing so.
The battle at Hawes Shop on May 28th cost Gregg's division 256 men dead, wounded, and missing. Another 41 were casualties in Custer's brigade. One of Custer's dead was Private John Huff, the 5th Michigan trooper who mortally wounded Jeb Stuart at Yellow Tavern a little over 2 weeks earlier.
Confederate losses, though never officially reported, were probably heavier than the Federals. Gregg said 187 dead rebels were buried on the battlefield, and 40 to 50 wounded had been left behind by the enemy. But after the fighting ended, both sides had what they needed. From Union prisoners, Wade Hampton discovered that 5th and 6th Corps were definitely across the Pamunkey. And from Confederate prisoners, Sheridan learned the positions of Anderson's Corps and Ewell's Corps. So the stage was now set for the next clash between the two armies, which might well be decisive, since with only 9 miles now separating the Army of Northern Virginia from Richmond, Robert E. Lee was running out of maneuvering room. If the Federals now got around him again or pierced his line, the result would most likely be complete defeat.
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation, and our recommendation this time is Robert E. Lee, A Life by Alan C. Gelso.
Gelso's biography of Lee came out a couple of years ago, and I'm not sure why we didn't recommend it back then, but this seemed like a good time to rectify that, so here you go. Gelso is always a good read, and you may not always agree with what he says, but you're never sorry you picked up one of his books.
Don't forget you can find a complete list of all of our book recommendations if you head over to the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org.
As we wrap up this episode, we wanted to let you know that a week or so ago, we released Members Episode number 160, which is titled The Death of a Millionaire General. And it's a show about the mortal wounding and death of Brigadier General James Wadsworth of New York during the fighting in the Wilderness. Wadsworth's name may be most familiar to you guys from the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg in July 1863, but here we look at the circumstances of his death in May 1864. So we hope the members of the Strawfoot Brigade enjoyed that. If you'd like to join the Strawfoot Brigade over on Patreon and support the podcast and also get access to those 160 members episodes, then you can find info about how to join at the website. And with that, we'll bring the curtain down on this show. Tracy and I do hope that you join us again next time, but until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.